There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the northern seas in the hour before true dark, when the sun has gone down but the sky has not yet surrendered its last pale light, and the water turns the color of hammered pewter, and the wind, which has been busy all day pushing at sails and worrying at the edges of cloaks, finally begins to rest. It is in this hour, somewhere between the 9th century and the 11th, that our story mostly lives, though we will wander earlier and later than that, the way any good long story wanders, following rivers back to their sources and forward to the seas they eventually reach. Tonight we are going to spend a very long time with the Vikings, not the Vikings of horned helmets and screaming battle cries, because that version of them was invented centuries after they were gone by people who never met them, but the Vikings as they most often actually were. Farmers, fishermen, traders, lawmakers, poets, mothers raising children beside a fire, old men mending fishing nets, young men standing at the prow of a ship watching the coastline of a country they had never seen. Slowly rise out of the mist. There is no need to rush through any of this. We have hours ahead of us, and the story of the Norse world is long and patient, built up slowly like silt at the bottom of a fjord, one season folding into the next, one generation setting down what the next generation would build upon. So let yourself settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There is nothing here that requires your alertness, only your quiet company, as we drift together through the long, unhurried history of the Viking Age. Long before anyone called them Vikings, the people who would carry that name lived scattered across a landscape that shaped nearly everything about who they became. Scandinavia, in the centuries before the Viking Age properly began, was a place of dramatic contrasts, and it is worth spending some time simply picturing it, because the land itself explains so much of what follows. To the west, along the coast of what is now Norway, the earth had been carved by ancient glaciers into deep, steep-walled fjords, long fingers of seawater reaching far inland between cliffs that rose sometimes 1,000 meters or more above the water, so that a farm might sit on a narrow shelf of green between towering rock and cold, dark water, reachable more easily by boat than by any road. Farmland in this stretch of the world was precious and scarce, tucked into pockets of flatter ground near the shore or on terraces cut into hillsides, and a family might spend generations coaxing barley and rye out of thin, rocky soil, supplementing what they grew with what the sea and the forest gave them freely, fish and seals and whales taken from the water, elk and reindeer hunted in the high country, berries and nuts gathered in the brief golden weeks of a northern autumn. To the east, across the mountains, the land opened into what is now Sweden, a gentler country in places, with broad lakes and slow rivers and forests of pine and birch that seemed to run on forever. Though even here the growing season was short, the winters long and dark, the summers bright but fleeting. And to the south, connecting the peninsula to the rest of the European continent, lay Denmark, flatter and more fertile than its northern neighbors, a land of low hills and wide fields and a coastline so intricately carved with islands and inlets that no single description quite does it justice, a place where farming was easier and settlements could grow larger and more permanent than almost anywhere else in the Norse world. It is worth remembering, as we move through this long history, that Norway, Sweden, and Denmark in this period were not the unified nations we might picture on a modern map. They were patchworks of smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms, ruled by local lords and petty kings who might command the loyalty of a single fjord or a handful of valleys, who fought each other as often as they cooperated, and who would spend the coming centuries slowly, sometimes violently, consolidating into the larger kingdoms that would eventually bear those familiar names. The climate of this world was, by the standards of most of Europe, harsh and demanding, though it is worth noting that the centuries just before and during the Viking Age happened to fall within what climatologists now call the medieval warm period, a stretch of time when average temperatures across the North Atlantic were somewhat higher than in the centuries before or after, which meant longer growing seasons, more reliable harvests, and, crucially, seas that were more navigable for more of the year than they might otherwise have been. This warming was gradual and modest by the standards of a single human lifetime, hardly noticeable from one year to the next, but across generations it opened possibilities that had not existed before, easier sailing routes, longer summers for farming, and eventually, as we will see much later in this story, land in the far North Atlantic that could, for a time, support settlement. But even in this relatively favorable climatic window, life in Scandinavia demanded an intimate, practical knowledge of the natural world that is difficult for those of us living in heated homes with food available at any hour to fully appreciate. A family's survival through the dark months depended on decisions made in the bright months. How much grain was stored, how much meat was salted or smoked, how well the turf roof of the longhouse had been maintained against the coming snow, how much firewood had been gathered and split and stacked to dry. There was no room in this world for carelessness, and the rhythms of Norse life, the festivals, the laws, the social obligations, all of it grew up around this fundamental need to prepare, endure, and prepare again. The people themselves, in the centuries leading up to what we now call the Viking Age, which conventionally begins around the year 793 and runs to sometime in the mid-11th century, were part of a broader Germanic cultural world that stretched across northern Europe, sharing linguistic roots, religious beliefs, and social structures with peoples in what is now Germany, the Low Countries, and England, even as regional variations grew more distinct over time. The language spoken across most of Scandinavia in this period is what scholars now call Old Norse, a tongue that would eventually branch into the modern Scandinavian languages, and it was a language rich in poetry, in complex kennings and layered metaphor, well suited to the oral storytelling tradition that preserved so much of what we now know about Norse belief and history, even though writing in the runic alphabet was used mostly for short inscriptions, memorial stones, and practical notations rather than for long narrative texts. It would not be until well after the Viking Age, when Christian scribes in Iceland began writing down the old sagas and poems, that this oral tradition was captured on parchment in any extensive way, and that fact alone should remind us to hold our knowledge of pre-Christian Norse society with a certain gentle humility, because so much of what we know comes to us filtered through centuries of retelling, through Christian scribes describing a pagan world their grandparents had abandoned, through outsiders like Frankish monks and Arab travelers who observed the Norse with the particular biases and misunderstandings that outsiders always bring. Society in pre-Viking Scandinavia was organized around the household, the farm, and increasingly around loose networks of chieftains who competed for prestige, resources, and the loyalty of free men willing to follow them. At the base of the society were the free farmers, called bondi, men and women who owned or worked land, who might be quite prosperous or quite modest depending on the quality and extent of their holdings, and who formed the backbone of Norse communities, gathering periodically at assemblies called things, a word that survives today in the Icelandic parliament, the Althing, to settle disputes, make communal decisions, and maintain the customary laws that governed marriage, inheritance, property, and violence. Above the free farmers stood various ranks of chieftains and, in some regions, kings, though kingship in this early period was often a fairly modest and localized affair, an extension of chieftaincy rather than the centralized royal authority we might associate with medieval European monarchies further south. Below the free farmers, and forming a significant portion of the population in some areas, were thralls, enslaved people who might be born into that status, captured in raids, or reduced to it through debt, and whose labor was essential to the functioning of larger farms and households, a grim and important fact about Norse society that deserves acknowledgement even in a story meant to soothe rather than trouble, because understanding a people fully means understanding both their beauty and their brutality. What set this world on the path toward the Viking Age, toward the sudden and dramatic expansion of Norse activity across the seas that would define the coming centuries, was a slow accumulation of factors rather than any single dramatic cause, and it is worth sitting with this complexity for a moment rather than reaching for a simpler story, because the truth, as it so often is more interesting than the simplification. Population growth in Scandinavia during these warmer, more productive centuries meant more sons competing for a finite amount of good farmland, particularly in Norway where arable land was already scarce and where the custom of primogeniture, in which the eldest son inherited the family farm, left younger sons needing to find their own fortune elsewhere. Advances in shipbuilding, which we will explore in detail a little later in our journey tonight, gave the Norse the technical capacity to cross open ocean with a confidence and efficiency that no other European seafaring culture of the period could match. Political consolidation and conflict within Scandinavia, as ambitious chieftains fought to expand their power, created both the incentive for defeated rivals and their followers to seek opportunity abroad and the organizational capacity, in the form of bands of armed, loyal followers, to actually carry out large-scale raiding and eventually conquest and settlement. And beyond Scandinavia's shores, the wider world offered genuine opportunity. The monasteries and towns of the British Isles and continental Europe held movable wealth, precious metals, and portable treasures, often lightly defended, at exactly the moment when Norse shipbuilders had perfected vessels capable of reaching them quickly, striking, and withdrawing before any organized resistance could be mustered. All of these threads were quietly weaving together across the 8th century, gathering slowly like storm clouds building on a distant horizon, until on a summer morning in the year 793, They would suddenly, violently, and unforgettably announce themselves to the wider world at a small island monastery off the coast of northern England. But that morning is still some distance ahead of us in this telling, and there is a great deal more to understand about the world the Norse came from before we arrive at the world they were about to disturb. To understand the Vikings, and here we might begin using that word a little more freely, understanding that it originally described an activity, going Viking, meaning to go raiding or trading overseas, rather than an ethnicity or a permanent identity, so that a farmer might be a Viking for one summer and simply a farmer for the rest of his life. We need to spend real time inside the daily rhythm of the world they came from, because the raids and voyages that made the Norse famous to history were, for most people, most of the time, brief interruptions in lives built overwhelmingly around farming, fishing, craft, and family. Picture, if you will, a longhouse in early autumn, the central dwelling of a Norse farmstead, a long rectangular structure built of timber where timber was available or of turf and stone in the more sparsely wooded regions of Iceland and the far north, its roof a thick layer of sod that in summer might sprout grass and small flowers, giving the building the appearance of a low green hill with smoke curling gently from a hole at its ridge. Inside, a single long room, sometimes divided by low partitions, would house an entire extended family along with, in the colder months, some of the household's most valuable livestock, brought inside for warmth and protection, so that the smell of wood smoke mingled with the earthier smell of cattle and sheep, and the sound of the wind outside was cut through by the low conversation of people working at various tasks along the length of a central hearth that burned, carefully tended, through the long winter nights. The rhythm of the year governed everything. Spring brought lambing and calving, the plowing and sowing of fields with barley, oats, and rye where the soil allowed it, and the first fishing expeditions as the ice retreated from harbors and rivers. Summer was the season of intense labor and, for some, the season of travel, whether for trade, raiding, or simply visiting kin in distant valleys, since the long daylight hours and calmer seas made this the only truly practical window for extended journeys. It was also the time for haymaking, an activity so central to Norse agricultural survival that entire households, including children old enough to help, would spend weeks cutting and drying grass to store as winter fodder for livestock, because a poor hay harvest could mean starving animals by midwinter, which in turn meant a family's wealth and food supply for the following year would be devastated. Autumn brought the harvest of whatever grain had been sown, the slaughter of livestock that could not be fed through the winter, the salting and smoking and drying of meat and fish to preserve it, and a general hurried preparation for the months of scarcity and darkness ahead. And then came winter, long and often brutally cold, especially in the more northern reaches of Norway and in the interior of Sweden, a season when outdoor work slowed to what was strictly necessary, when families spent long hours indoors around the hearth engaged in the countless small crafts that sustained a household, spinning wool into thread, weaving that thread into the heavy woolen cloth called wadmal that clothed most of the Norse population, carving wood into tools and implements, repairing fishing nets and telling stories, the long oral tradition of myth, genealogy, and history that was passed from one generation to the next precisely in these dark, enclosed winter evenings when there was little else to do but talk and listen. Norse society placed women in a position that, while still clearly patriarchal by modern standards, granted them a degree of legal standing, economic responsibility, and social respect that surprised and sometimes scandalized outside observers from more restrictive cultures. A married woman typically controlled the keys to the household storehouses, a literal and symbolic authority over the family's food supplies and valuables that was taken seriously in law and custom. Women could, under certain circumstances, own property, initiate divorce, and inherit wealth, and the archaeological record includes graves of women buried with the kind of high-status goods, and occasionally weapons, that suggest at least some women held significant social power or perhaps even led households and communities in their own right, though the exact nature and extent of any female participation in raiding or warfare remains genuinely debated among historians and should not be overstated. When men of a household were away for extended periods, whether trading, raiding, or simply working distant pastures, it fell to the women left behind to manage the farm, direct the labor of servants and thralls, make decisions about resources, and effectively run the household as its practical head, a responsibility that both reflected and reinforced the real authority women held within this society. Farming techniques varied considerably across the different regions of the Norse world, shaped always by the particular demands of local soil and climate. In the more fertile lowlands of Denmark and southern Sweden, mixed agriculture predominated, with fields of grain rotated alongside pasture for cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, and the plow, often a simple ard that scratched rather than turned the soil, though heavier plows were increasingly used in the better soils, was pulled by oxen through fields that had been cleared of forest, sometimes generations earlier, through the patient and laborious work of felling trees and burning stumps. In the steeper, rockier terrain of western Norway, farming was necessarily smaller in scale, often supplemented heavily by fishing, sealing, and the hunting of both land and sea mammals, so that a coastal Norwegian family might draw a significant portion of its diet and its tradable surplus from the sea rather than the soil, an orientation toward maritime resources that, not coincidentally, produced generations of people intimately skilled with boats, currents, and the reading of weather. Skills that would prove enormously valuable once Norse ambitions turned toward the open ocean. Trade, even before the classic Viking age of raiding began, connected Scandinavia to a wider world in ways that are easy to underestimate. Norse traders traveled south along the rivers of what is now Russia and Eastern Europe, exchanging furs, amber, walrus ivory, and enslaved captives for silver, silk, and other luxury goods flowing from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, a trade network that predates and runs parallel to the more famous raiding activity in the West, and one we will return to at greater length later in our journey tonight, when we follow Norse traders and warriors deep into the river systems of the East and all the way to the walls of Constantinople itself. Markets and trading settlements grew up at strategic points, places like Ribe in Denmark and, somewhat later, Birker in Sweden and Koppang in Norway, seasonal or year-round settlements where craftsmen, traders, and travelers from across the Norse world and beyond gathered to exchange goods, news, and inevitably, the kind of information about distant lands, their wealth, their defenses, and their vulnerabilities, that would later inform decisions about where to raid and where to settle. It is worth pausing on this point, because it complicates the simple image of the Viking as a sudden, unprecedented shock arriving from nowhere. The Norse world of the 8th century was already deeply connected by trade to the wider societies of Europe and beyond, already accumulating knowledge of distant coastlines, foreign wealth, and the comparative weakness or strength of various kingdoms and religious institutions, knowledge that the coming generations of raiders and settlers would put to increasingly ambitious use. Craft and material culture in this period reveal a society of considerable skill and aesthetic sophistication, whatever the stereotype of the unwashed, unlettered barbarian might suggest. Norse smiths worked iron into tools, weapons, and everyday implements of genuine quality, and the archaeological record is full of finely wrought jewelry in silver, gold, and bronze, brooches and pendants decorated in the distinctive interlocking animal-style ornamentation that characterizes so much Norse art of this period, intricate patterns of stylized beasts, their bodies elongated and intertwined in ways that suggest both technical mastery and a genuine artistic tradition passed down and refined across generations. Textile production, largely the domain of women, was similarly sophisticated, producing not just the practical wadmal cloth but finer weaves, dyed in colors derived from local plants and, for the wealthy, imported dyestuffs, and decorated with woven or embroidered patterns that signaled status and identity. This was, in short, a rich and complex society, deeply connected to place and season, organized around family, farm, and the slowly accumulating obligations and loyalties of chieftaincy, and equipped, through both accumulated skill and accumulating desperation among its landless younger sons, with exactly the tools it would need when, in the final decades of the 8th century, the wider world's wealth and vulnerability finally came into clear enough focus to act upon. No account of the Norse world, however sleepy and unhurried its pace, can pass by without spending some quiet time among the gods the Norse believed in, because their mythology was not a separate compartment of life set aside for festivals and priests, but a living framework that shaped how they understood fate, courage, death, and the workings of the natural world around them. At the center of this cosmology stood Yggdrasil, the great world tree, an immense ash whose branches were said to stretch out over all the 9 worlds and whose roots reached down into wells of wisdom and fate, a single vast, living structure that connected the realm of gods, the realm of humans, the realm of giants, the realm of the dead, and other domains inhabited by elves and dwarves, all of it bound together by this single enormous tree that the Norse imagination placed at the very center of existence. It is a beautiful image to sit with, and it is worth noting how different it is from the simple heaven and earth cosmology familiar from later Christian tradition that would eventually replace it. This instead a layered, interconnected universe held together by roots and branches, tended by 3 Norns, female beings of fate, who drew water from a sacred well to nourish the tree's roots each day, a quiet, patient act of maintenance woven into the very structure of the Norse understanding of the cosmos. Among the gods themselves, Odin held a position of particular complexity, the Allfather, god of wisdom, war, poetry, and death, a figure who had sacrificed one of his own eyes at the well of Mimir in exchange for wisdom, and who had hung himself, by his own account preserved in later poetry, from the branches of Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, a sacrifice of himself to himself, in order to gain knowledge of the runes, the magical symbols that carried power. Beyond their use as a simple writing system, Odin was restless in questing, wandering the 9 worlds in disguise, often as an old man in a broad hat and cloak, gathering knowledge, testing the wisdom and hospitality of gods and mortals alike, and it was to Odin that the greatest warriors who died in battle were said to be drawn, half of them at least, gathered into his hall of Valhalla by the choosers of the slain, the Valkyries, to feast and train for the final battle that awaited at the end of all things. Beside Odin stood Thor, perhaps the most beloved of the Norse gods among ordinary people, a god of thunder and immense physical strength, protector of humanity and of the gods themselves against the encroaching chaos of the giants, wielding his hammer Mjolnir, a weapon so central to Norse identity that small hammer pendants, worn around the neck, have been found across the Norse world in numbers that rival or exceed the small crosses worn by early Christians, suggesting how deeply Thor's protective, straightforward strength resonated with people whose daily lives depended on resilience against forces larger than themselves, whether storms at sea or the long dark of winter. The Norse pantheon was populated with many other figures worth a moment's quiet attention. Freya, goddess of love, fertility, beauty, and also, in a detail that complicates any simple categorization, war and death, who received her own share of the fallen slain in battle alongside Odin, and who traveled in a chariot pulled by cats and possessed a cloak of falcon feathers that allowed the wearer to fly. Her brother Freyr, god of fertility, prosperity, and good harvests, associated with sunshine and rain and the general flourishing of crops and livestock upon which every Norse family's survival depended. Loki, a trickster figure of ambiguous and shifting loyalty, sometimes helping the gods out of trouble he himself had caused, sometimes betraying them outright, eventually revealed as the architect of Baldr's death, an act that set in motion the chain of events leading toward the end of the world, and whose eventual punishment, bound beneath the earth with a serpent's venom dripping onto his face, explained in Norse belief the earthquakes that shook the land, understood as Loki's agonized writhing against his bonds. And Baldr himself, gentle and beloved, god of light and purity, whose death, orchestrated by Loki's malice, was mourned by every being in the 9 worlds except one, a giantess who refused to weep and who was, in fact, Loki in disguise, and whose refusal meant Baldr could not be released from the realm of the dead. A story shot through with a particular melancholy about the irreversibility of loss that must have resonated deeply with people who buried children, spouses, and parents with a frequency that modern audiences, living in an age of modern medicine, can barely imagine. Central to Norse belief, and worth dwelling on for a moment because it explains so much about the values and temperament of the culture we are exploring tonight, was the concept of fate, or WYRD, an understanding that the course of a person's life, and indeed the ultimate course of the entire cosmos, was in some sense already woven, determined by the Norns at the base of Yggdrasil, and that even the gods themselves were not exempt from this fate, most dramatically illustrated in the prophecy of Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world, in which the gods themselves were destined to fall, Odin devoured by the great wolf Fenrir, Thor dying after slaying and being slain by the world serpent Jormungandr, the sun swallowed, the stars falling from the sky, the world consumed by fire and then sinking beneath the waves, only for a new green earth to rise afterward, populated by a few surviving gods and 2 human survivors who had sheltered within the branches of Yggdrasil itself. This belief in an unavoidable, foreordained end, one that even the gods could see coming and could not prevent, produced a particular cultural attitude that historians and readers of the sagas often point to as distinctively Norse. Not despair, but a kind of clear-eyed, dignified acceptance, a belief that what mattered was not whether one's fate could be avoided, since it could not, but how one met it, with courage, with honor, with the kind of reputation that would live on in memory and story, long after the individual life had ended. This is why Norse poetry and saga literature places such enormous weight on reputation and on the manner of a person's death, because in a worldview where fate itself was fixed, The only true freedom left to a person was the freedom to face that fate well. Religious practice in the Norse world was, as far as historians can reconstruct it, less centralized and less formally organized than the Christian church that the Norse would increasingly encounter and eventually adopt, existing instead as a set of practices woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Seasonal sacrifices called blot, offerings of food, drink, and sometimes animals made at significant points in the agricultural and calendar year to secure the favor of the gods for good harvests. Safe voyages or victory in conflict, conducted often by local chieftains or heads of households rather than by a distinct priestly class, though certain temple sites, most famously the great temple complex described by later chroniclers at Uppsala in Sweden, did serve as more formal centers of worship and pilgrimage, drawing people from considerable distances for periodic, large-scale religious festivals. Burial practices, too, reflected this cosmology, with the dead sent into the next world equipped according to their status and needs, weapons and tools for warriors and craftsmen, jewelry and household goods for women, and, in the most elaborate and famous cases, entire ships, buried intact beneath earthen mounds, vessels meant, it seems, to carry the deceased onward into whatever journey awaited them beyond death, a practice that has given modern archaeologists some of the richest and most evocative windows into Norse material culture and belief that survive anywhere, ship burials whose timbers and grave goods, preserved for over 1,000 years beneath protective layers of clay and turf, still speak, in their careful arrangement, to a people who took the passage from this world to the next with tremendous seriousness and care. It is this world of gods who accepted their own doom with dignity, of fate woven and unavoidable, of reputation as the one true form of immortality available to mortal beings, that shaped the men and women who would, in the coming chapters of our story tonight, step aboard their ships and sail out into the unknown, carrying with them not just cargo and weapons but an entire way of understanding courage, death, and what makes a life worth living. If there is a single piece of technology that explains the Viking Age, that turns a collection of scattered farming communities along the fjords and lowlands of Scandinavia into a force capable of reshaping the political map of medieval Europe, it is the ship, and it is worth spending a genuinely unhurried stretch of time with it tonight, because the Norse longship was not simply a boat but the culmination of centuries of accumulated craft knowledge, a piece of engineering so elegant and effective that its basic design principles are still studied and admired by shipbuilders today. The archaeological discoveries that have allowed us to understand these vessels in such intimate detail, most famously the ships recovered from burial mounds at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, and the wrecks deliberately sunk to block a channel near Skuldelef in Denmark, reveal a construction technique known as clinker building, in which overlapping planks of oak, split rather than sawn along the grain to preserve the wood's natural strength, were riveted together with iron nails and caulked, with wool or animal hair soaked in tar to keep the vessel watertight, built up plank by plank from a solid keel until the hull's characteristic shape emerged, a long, slender, remarkably flexible form that could flex and twist with the movement of waves in a way that stiffer, more rigidly built ships could not, absorbing the punishment of open ocean swells rather than fighting against them. This flexibility was not an accident but a deliberate and sophisticated engineering choice, and it gave Norse ships a seaworthiness that surprised and often terrified the people they encountered, because a longship could survive conditions that would have broken apart the more heavily built vessels common in the Mediterranean and elsewhere in Europe, riding over waves rather than plowing through them, its shallow draft allowing it to sail not just across open ocean but also up rivers and even overland in short stretches, dragged on rollers by its crew when necessary, and to land directly on beaches without need of a harbor or dock, simply running the bow up onto sand or shingle and allowing the crew to step directly ashore, an operational flexibility that gave Norse raiders and traders access to targets that other seafaring peoples, dependent on established ports, simply could not reach. The ships also varied considerably by purpose, and it is worth distinguishing between them rather than lumping all Norse vessels together under the single popular image of the dragon-prowed warship. The classic longship, built for speed and for carrying warriors, was long and narrow, low in the water, powered by a single square sail of woven wool, dyed sometimes in striking colors and patterns, supplemented by oars along both sides that allowed the crew to maintain speed and maneuverability even when the wind failed or when precise control was needed near a coastline or in a river mouth, a vessel that might carry anywhere from a dozen to several dozen warriors depending on its size, with the grandest examples, built for kings and the most powerful chieftains, stretching well over 30 meters in length and capable of carrying crews of 60 or more. Alongside these warships, The Norse also built broader, deeper cargo vessels known as nars, less elegant and less fast but far more capable of carrying the bulk goods, livestock, timber, and household possessions that made long-distance trade and eventually transoceanic settlement possible, the workhorses of Norse expansion that receive far less popular attention than their sleek warrior cousins but that were, in truth, equally essential to the story we are following tonight. Navigation across open water without the compass, which would not become common in European seafaring for centuries yet, depended on an intimate, deeply practiced knowledge of the natural world that modern sailors, dependent on satellite positioning, can scarcely imagine needing to develop. Norse sailors read the sun's position by day and the stars by night, understood the behavior of ocean currents and prevailing winds across different seasons, watched the flight patterns of seabirds, which often indicated the direction and even the approximate distance of land, observed the color and temperature and even the taste of the water, which could indicate proximity to river mouths or shallow coastal waters, and passed down, generation to generation, detailed oral knowledge of specific routes, how many days' sail lay between one point and another under favorable conditions, what landmarks to expect along a given coast, and where dangerous currents, rocks, or shoals lay hidden beneath the surface. Some scholars have suggested the Norse may also have used a sun compass, a simple device with a shadow-casting gnomon that could help maintain a bearing even under the hazy skies common in northern waters, and later medieval Icelandic sources mention a mysterious sunstone, possibly a crystal capable of polarizing light and revealing the sun's position even through cloud cover, though the practical use and effectiveness of such a stone remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate rather than settled fact, an area where our knowledge, like so much about the more technical aspects of Norse seafaring, remains tantalizingly incomplete. The social organization required to build and crew these ships tells us something important about Norse society more broadly. A longship was an enormously expensive undertaking, requiring not just significant quantities of high-quality oak, itself an increasingly scarce resource in some regions after centuries of shipbuilding and construction had thinned the great forests, but also months of skilled labor from shipwrights, blacksmiths producing the iron rivets and fittings, and weavers producing the massive sail, which alone might require the wool of dozens of sheep and months of spinning and weaving by numerous women. Working in coordination. Financing and organizing such a project required real wealth and real social authority, which meant that ship ownership and command was concentrated among chieftains and the wealthier free farmers who could either fund construction themselves or persuade a following of free men to contribute labor, materials, or simply their own participation as crew in exchange for a share of whatever wealth a voyage might produce, whether through trade or raid. This economic reality shaped the social structure of Viking expeditions themselves, which were rarely, especially in the earlier decades of the Viking Age, organized as instruments of any centralized royal policy, but were instead essentially private, entrepreneurial ventures, a chieftain and his followers pooling resources and risk in the hope of a profitable return, a structure that helps explain both the somewhat chaotic, decentralized character of early Viking raiding, in which many different bands operated independently along many different coastlines with no overall coordination, and the eventual transition, as certain leaders accumulated enough wealth, prestige, and followers, toward the larger, more organized campaigns and eventually outright conquests that would characterize the later Viking Age. It is worth, before we move on to the raids themselves, sitting for a moment with the simple physical experience of a Viking Age sea voyage, because it helps ground the more dramatic historical narrative in something more human and tangible. A crew crossing open water, whether the relatively short hop across the North Sea to Britain or the far longer and more dangerous crossing to Iceland or beyond, faced weeks of exposure to the elements aboard a vessel with no cabin, no shelter beyond perhaps a simple awning rigged for the worst weather, sleeping in leather sleeping bags or wrapped in woolen cloaks amid their cargo and provisions, subsisting on dried fish, hard bread, cheese, and whatever fresh water they had managed to store in barrels or skins, constantly wet from spray and rain, cold even in summer once beyond sight of land, and entirely dependent on the accumulated skill and judgment of their captain and the collective, practiced coordination of the crew at the oars and the sail. It was, by any modern standard, an extraordinarily demanding and dangerous way to travel, and the fact that Norse sailors undertook such voyages routinely, developing over generations a level of comfort with open ocean sailing that no other European culture of the period could match, stands as one of the most genuinely remarkable achievements of the entire medieval world, a quiet, unglamorous mastery of wind, wave, And would that made everything else in this long story, the raids, the conquests, the settlements at the very edge of the known world, ultimately possible. There is a particular stillness to the island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England, a place where the tides themselves govern the rhythm of daily life, since the causeway connecting the island to the mainland disappears twice a day beneath the incoming sea, leaving the small monastic community that had grown up there since the 7th century in a kind of temporary isolation, cut off from the world by water until the tide withdrew again. It was here, at this quiet religious community founded by Saint Aidan and made famous throughout Christian Europe as the resting place of Saint Cuthbert, one of the most venerated figures in early English Christianity, that on the 8th of June in the year 793, according to the most commonly accepted dating, a small fleet of Norse ships appeared off the coast, and what followed has come down to us as the conventional starting point of the Viking Age, the moment when the wider world first became violently, unforgettably aware of what these seafaring people from the north were capable of. The attack itself, as best we can reconstruct it from the limited surviving sources, was swift, brutal, and utterly unexpected by a community that had no reason to anticipate armed raiders arriving by sea from a direction that had, until that morning, produced nothing more threatening than the occasional trading vessel. The monastery was plundered of its portable wealth, the gold and silver vessels used in religious services, the finely wrought reliquaries housing sacred relics, the jeweled bindings of illuminated manuscripts, treasures that had been accumulated over more than a century of royal and noble patronage and that represented, in the raiders' eyes, a remarkably concentrated and lightly defended source of portable wealth. Monks were killed or driven into the surrounding sea, others taken captive to be sold into slavery, a fate that awaited a significant number of victims of Viking raids throughout this period, and one that deserves acknowledgement alongside the more romanticized aspects of Norse seafaring culture we have spent time with tonight, because the human cost of these raids, borne by monks, farmers, and townspeople across the British Isles and continental Europe, was real and severe, whatever admiration we might separately hold for Norse craftsmanship, poetry, and seamanship. News of the attack spread quickly through the interconnected world of early medieval Christian scholarship, and the shock it produced is preserved for us with unusual vividness in a letter written not long after by Alcuin of York, one of the most learned scholars of his age, then serving at the court of the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, who wrote to the King of Northumbria and to the bishop and community at Lindisfarne itself expressing a horror that reads, even at this distance of well over 1,000 years, as genuinely raw and immediate. Alcuin's letters describe the attack as an event without precedent in living memory or written record, a catastrophe that seemed to him to carry a kind of theological weight, evidence perhaps of divine displeasure with the moral state of the kingdom, since it seemed inconceivable to him that pagan raiders could strike so effectively and so violently at one of Christendom's most sacred sites unless some greater cosmic order had permitted or even willed it. This reaction, extreme as it might seem, gives us a genuine sense of just how disruptive and terrifying this event was to contemporaries, a shock roughly comparable, in the emotional register of the sources that survive, to how a modern society might react to an entirely unprecedented and devastating attack against one of its most cherished and sacred institutions. It would be a mistake, though, to treat Lindisfarne as a bolt entirely from the blue, an isolated first contact between two worlds that had never previously interacted, and it is worth pausing to complicate that popular narrative a little, in keeping with the more careful, patient approach to history we are taking throughout this long night together. Scandinavian traders and travelers had almost certainly been in contact with the British Isles and the near continent for generations before 793, exchanging goods, and quite possibly information, along established if modest trade routes across the North Sea, and there is at least one earlier recorded raid, a smaller and less famous attack on the English coast at Portland in Dorset some years before Lindisfarne, in which local officials mistook the raiders for ordinary traders and were killed. For their error, an episode that receives far less attention than Lindisfarne, but that reminds us that the pattern of Norse raiding had already begun to establish itself before that particular June morning brought it so dramatically and irreversibly to the attention of the wider Christian world. What made Lindisfarne so significant, then, was not that it was entirely unprecedented, but that it struck at a target of such symbolic and religious importance, and that the sheer violence and effectiveness of the attack, carried out by people who observers considered entirely foreign, entirely pagan, and entirely without the shared cultural and religious framework that governed even hostile relations between Christian kingdoms, seemed to announce the arrival of a genuinely new and destabilizing force in the political landscape of early medieval Europe, one that would only grow more active, more ambitious, and more consequential across the decades that followed. In the years immediately following Lindisfarne, further raids struck other vulnerable coastal and island monasteries across the British Isles. The monastery at Jarrow, associated with the great historian Bede, was attacked the following year, and religious communities on Iona, off the western coast of Scotland, suffered repeated raids across the following decades. Attacks severe enough that the monastic community there eventually relocated much of its most precious material, including, tradition holds, the illuminated manuscript now known as the Book of Kells, to the relative safety of Ireland. These early raids shared a common character that distinguishes them from the larger, more sustained campaigns of conquest and settlement that would follow in later decades. They were, for the most part, quick, opportunistic strikes by relatively small bands of raiders, arriving suddenly by sea, striking a target chosen for its wealth and its vulnerability, and withdrawing again before any organized military response could be assembled, a pattern that exploited both the genuine tactical advantages of Norse seafaring, speed, surprise, and the ability to strike almost anywhere along an extensive and poorly defended coastline, and the simple fact that early medieval English and Irish kingdoms, accustomed to threats arriving by land from neighboring rivals, had no established system of coastal defense or naval patrol capable of anticipating or intercepting attacks that could appear, strike, and vanish within the span of a single day or two. It would take the various kingdoms of the British Isles and the wider Christian world some time to adjust to this new kind of threat, and in the meantime, the raids continued, and gradually intensified, and gradually, too, the ambitions of the raiders themselves began to grow, from opportunistic plunder towards something more sustained, more organized, and ultimately more transformative for the political map of the entire region, a shift we will follow closely across the chapters still ahead of us tonight. In the decades following the attack on Lindisfarne, Norse raiding activity spread with a kind of steady, patient persistence across an increasingly wide arc of coastline, from the northern and western shores of the British Isles down through Ireland, along the coasts of what is now France, and eventually into the Mediterranean and up the great rivers of continental Europe. And it is worth taking our time tracing this expansion carefully, region by region, because the pattern of Norse activity varied considerably depending on geography, the particular strengths and weaknesses of local kingdoms, and the specific ambitions of the various bands and leaders involved, so that no single simple story quite captures the full breadth of what was happening across this vast and varied stretch of coastline over the course of the 9th century. Ireland, in these early decades, became a particularly significant focus of Norse activity, its many small, competing kingdoms and its wealth of monastic communities, similar in character to the vulnerable target that Lindisfarne had represented, offering both opportunity and a landscape of chronic political fragmentation that raiders could exploit. Norse fleets began appearing along the Irish coast within a few years of Lindisfarne, and the raids that followed targeted monasteries with a persistence that Irish chroniclers, whose annals provide us with some of the richest surviving documentary evidence for this period anywhere in the Norse world, recorded with mounting alarm across the opening decades of the 9th century. What distinguishes the Irish experience from the earlier English raids, though, is the relatively rapid transition from opportunistic raiding toward permanent settlement, as Norse leaders began establishing fortified bases, initially intended simply as secure winter camps or as staging points for further raiding, that gradually grew into permanent towns, a pattern most famously exemplified by the founding of Dublin, established as a Norse settlement on the River Liffey in the middle of the 9th century, a site chosen for its excellent natural harbor and its strategic position for trade and further raiding, and one that would grow, over the following 2 centuries, into one of the most important and prosperous trading towns in the entire Norse world, its wealth built substantially on trade in silver, furs, and less comfortably for modern audiences to sit with, enslaved captives, a grim but historically significant dimension of the Dublin slave trade that connected Ireland to markets as distant as the Islamic world. We will return to Dublin and to the broader story of the Norse in Ireland a little later in our journey tonight, but it is worth flagging here, early in our discussion of the raiding period, this crucial transition from raid to settlement that would repeat itself, with variations, across nearly every region the Norse touched. Along the coast of Francia, the vast kingdom, later empire, ruled first by Charlemagne and then by his successors, Norse raids began somewhat later than in the British Isles but escalated with particular intensity from the 830s onward, striking at wealthy trading towns and monasteries along the coast and, crucially, penetrating deep inland by sailing up the major rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, vessels shallow enough in draft to navigate waters that would have been impassable to more conventional European ships, allowing Norse fleets to threaten cities that lay far from the coast and that had never before needed to consider themselves vulnerable to seaborne attack. The great trading town of Dorstad on the Rhine, one of the wealthiest commercial centers in northern Europe at the time, suffered repeated devastating raids across the 830s and 840s that contributed significantly to its eventual decline, and Paris itself, then a smaller and less centrally important city than it would later become but still a significant political and religious center, was attacked multiple times across the 9th century, most famously in a prolonged siege in 885 and 886 that we will examine in more detail shortly, an episode that captures particularly well the later, more organized and ambitious character that Viking campaigns in Francia had developed by the closing decades of the century. The internal political situation within Francia contributed significantly to Norse success in this period, since the vast Carolingian Empire built by Charlemagne fractured, following his death and the subsequent divisions among his descendants, into competing and often mutually hostile kingdoms, a political fragmentation that meant Norse raiders frequently found local Frankish rulers more interested in using them as mercenaries or allies against domestic rivals than in cooperating to mount a unified defense, and that meant, too, that ransom payments, known to the Franks as Danegeld though that term is more strongly associated with England, became an increasingly common and increasingly expensive strategy for buying off raiding fleets, a strategy that provided short-term relief but that, predictably, tended to encourage further raids by demonstrating that Frankish kingdoms would pay handsomely to avoid conflict, a pattern of escalating extortion that we will see repeated, in an even more extensively documented form, in the English context in the chapters ahead. It would be incomplete to discuss Norse raiding activity in this period without acknowledging its reach beyond what most popular accounts of the Viking Age tend to emphasize, because Norse fleets, particularly those operating from bases in Francia and Ireland, ventured considerably further afield than the North Sea and the English Channel across the middle decades of the 9th century, raiding along the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, engaging Muslim forces in what is now Spain and Portugal with mixed success, and on at least one notable occasion in 859 and 860, a fleet led by the Norse chieftains Bjorn Ironside and Hastion, figures who feature prominently in later, more legendary saga traditions, though the historical reliability of some details attached to them remains debated among historians, sailed into the Mediterranean itself, raiding along the coasts of southern France, the Balearic Islands, and North Africa, and according to the more elaborate later traditions surrounding this expedition, even reaching Italy, where a famous, though historically uncertain, story recounts that the raiders tricked their way into a fortified town by pretending their leader had died and requesting Christian burial within its walls, only to launch a surprise attack once inside, having apparently mistaken the town for the great prize of Rome itself. Whatever the precise historical accuracy of this particular colorful anecdote, the broader reach of this Mediterranean expedition confirms just how extensive Norse maritime ambition had become by the middle of the 9th century, a seafaring culture whose ships and whose confidence had grown, across barely more than half a century since that first shocking morning at Lindisfarne, to encompass raids and expeditions across an extraordinary span of the known world, from the cold northern waters of the British Isles to the warm Mediterranean coasts of southern Europe and North Africa, a breadth of activity that sets the stage for the even more consequential campaigns of conquest and settlement that would define the final decades of the 9th century and that we will turn our attention to next. By the middle of the 9th century, the character of Norse activity in England had begun to shift in ways that would ultimately prove far more consequential than the earlier decades of scattered coastal raiding, a shift most dramatically marked by the arrival, in the year 865, of what Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army, a force whose scale, ambition, and staying power distinguished it clearly from the hit-and-run raiding parties that had troubled English shores in the preceding decades. Where earlier raids had typically involved a handful of ships striking a single vulnerable target before withdrawing, the Great Heathen Army represented something closer to a full-scale invasion, a coalition of warbands drawn from across Scandinavia and united, at least for a time, under a shared leadership and a shared purpose that went well beyond simple plunder toward outright conquest and permanent territorial control. The composition and leadership of this force, as reconstructed from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later, more elaborate saga traditions, centered on several prominent figures, most notably three brothers, Ivar, sometimes called Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, whose father, according to later legendary tradition, though the historical details are genuinely uncertain and heavily embellished by later storytellers, was the semi-legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure who looms enormously large in the popular imagination of the Viking Age thanks to later saga literature and, in more recent times, television dramatization, but whose actual historical existence and exploits remain frustratingly difficult to separate from myth and later invention. Whatever the precise truth of Ragnar's own story, his sons, or at least the historical figure's later tradition attached to that lineage, led a force that landed first in East Anglia in the autumn of 865, and rather than immediately raiding, spent the winter there establishing a base, securing horses, supplies, and, according to the chronicle, a form of tribute or accommodation from the East Anglian king that allowed the army to overwinter in relative peace before turning its attention northward. The following year. The campaign that unfolded across the following years methodically dismantled the political independence of one Anglo-Saxon kingdom after another. In 866 the army moved north and captured York, the principal city of the Kingdom of Northumbria, exploiting a civil war between rival claimants to the Northumbrian throne to seize control with relative ease, and establishing there a base that would remain a center of Norse power in northern England for generations, eventually developing into the significant Norse-ruled city and kingdom of York, known in Old Norse as Jorvik, a place we will return to shortly because its subsequent history as a thriving, multicultural trading center reveals a great deal about how Norse conquest, once achieved, often gave way to a period of remarkably productive settlement and integration rather than simple ongoing destruction. From this northern base, the army turned south, campaigning against the Kingdom of Mercia in the English Midlands, and then, critically, against the Kingdom of East Anglia once more, where in 869 the East Anglian king, Edmund, was defeated in battle and killed, an event that later Christian tradition transformed into a story of martyrdom. Edmund refusing to renounce his Christian faith even under torture and execution at Norse hands, a story that made him a venerated saint and that, whatever its precise historical accuracy in the details of his death, reflects the genuine trauma that Norse conquest inflicted on the political and religious institutions of Anglo-Saxon England during these years. By the early 870s, 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, had fallen under significant Norse control or influence, their native ruling dynasties overthrown, killed, or reduced to client status, leaving only the Kingdom of Wessex in the south and west of England, still under fully independent Anglo-Saxon rule. And it was against Wessex that the Great Heathen Army, reinforced by a further wave of Norse warriors sometimes referred to by historians as the Great Summer Army, turned its attention in the mid-870s, setting the stage for a confrontation with a king whose response to this crisis would prove decisive not just for the immediate fate of Wessex but for the entire subsequent political trajectory of England, a king whose story deserves, and will receive, careful and unhurried attention in the chapter that follows this one. Before we move on to that story, though, it is worth pausing to consider what made the Great Heathen Army so much more effective and so much more consequential than the earlier decades of raiding had been. Part of the answer lies simply in scale, a genuinely large coalition force, likely numbering in the low thousands, considerably larger than the individual raiding bands of previous decades, capable of sustained campaigning across multiple seasons rather than a single summer strike. Part of the answer lies in the political disunity and internal weakness of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms themselves in this period, Northumbria in particular riven by succession disputes that the invading army exploited with considerable tactical skill, choosing to intervene at precisely the moment when internal division had left the kingdom least capable of mounting a unified defense. And part of the answer lies in an evolution of Norse strategic thinking itself, a shift from viewing England primarily as a source of portable plunder to be raided and abandoned toward viewing it as a source of land, tribute, and long-term political control worth conquering and holding, a shift reflected in the army's practice of overwintering in England rather than returning to Scandinavia between campaigning seasons, of securing horses to allow rapid overland movement between targets, and of installing puppet rulers or direct Norse control over conquered territories rather than simply plundering them and departing. This transition, from raiding to conquest to, eventually, settlement and governance, represents one of the most important developments in the entire Viking Age, and its consequences would reshape the political and cultural landscape of England for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for the substantial Norse settlement of eastern and northern England that would follow, and for the complex, often surprisingly cooperative relationship that would eventually develop between Norse settlers and their Anglo-Saxon neighbors in the territory that came to be known as the Danelaw. The king who inherited the defense of Wessex against this accumulating Norse pressure was Alfred, who came to the throne of Wessex in 871 following the death of his brother Athelred, at a moment of genuine crisis for his kingdom, with the great heathen army having already dismantled the independence of every other major Anglo-Saxon kingdom and now turning its full attention toward the one remaining holdout. And it is Alfred's response to this crisis, patient, adaptive, and ultimately successful, that earned him the epithet by which he remains known to this day, Alfred the Great, the only English monarch before or since to be so honored in common usage, and his story is worth following carefully tonight, not as a tale of dramatic, decisive triumph, but as a longer, more textured account of resilience, strategic patience, and eventual, hard-won stability. The early years of Alfred's reign brought repeated crisis rather than triumph. Norse forces campaigned against Wessex through the mid-870s with considerable success, and in early January of the year 878, in what came remarkably close to being the definitive end of Alfred's kingdom and quite possibly of independent Anglo-Saxon rule in England altogether, a Norse force under the leadership of Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack, a departure from the normal seasonal pattern of campaigning that caught Alfred's court entirely unprepared, forcing the king to flee with a small band of followers into the marshes of Somerset, taking refuge on the isolated, difficult-to-reach island of Athelney amid the wetlands, a period of hiding and vulnerability that later English tradition would embellish considerably, most famously in the legendary story of Alfred, disguised and unrecognized, taking shelter in a peasant woman's cottage and being scolded by her for allowing some cakes she had asked him to watch to burn while his mind was occupied with the desperate situation of his kingdom. A charming and almost certainly apocryphal tale that nonetheless captures something of the genuine desperation of this low point in Alfred's fortunes. From this position of apparent near-total defeat, though, Alfred began to rebuild, gathering forces from the loyal areas of Wessex and neighboring territories across the following months, and in May of 878 he led his assembled army to a decisive victory over Guthrum's forces at the Battle of Edington, a victory significant enough that it fundamentally altered the strategic balance between Wessex and the Norse forces operating in England, forcing Guthrum to submit to terms that included his own baptism as a Christian, with Alfred standing as his sponsor in a ceremony that, whatever its genuine religious content for either party, carried enormous symbolic and political weight, formally incorporating the defeated Norse leader into the shared Christian political culture of the region in a way that, however imperfectly it may have reflected Guthrum's actual private beliefs, established a framework for a more stable, negotiated relationship between Wessex and the Norse-controlled territories to its north and east going forward. This relationship was formalized in what has come to be known as the Treaty of Wedmore, or in some accounts a somewhat later and more detailed agreement, which established a boundary between Wessex and the territory that would become known as the Danelaw, the region of eastern and northern England, encompassing Northumbria, East Anglia, and part of Mercia, where Norse settlers and their descendants would live under their own laws and customs, distinct from the Anglo-Saxon legal traditions that continued to govern Wessex and the parts of Mercia that remained under Anglo-Saxon control. This arrangement, and it is worth sitting with its significance for a moment, marks the definitive transition of the Viking presence in England from a purely military and predatory phenomenon toward a genuine, permanent settlement, as substantial numbers of Norse farmers, craftsmen, and their families followed the earlier waves of warriors into eastern England, taking up land, in some cases land that had belonged to the Anglo-Saxon nobility and church before the conquest, and beginning to build permanent lives and communities across a swath of English territory that would remain culturally and legally distinct for generations, leaving a linguistic and toponymic legacy still visible today in the many place names across eastern and northern England ending in the Norse suffixes by, meaning farmstead or village, as in Whitby or Grimsby, and thorp, meaning a smaller secondary settlement, names that dot the map of modern England as quiet, enduring evidence of this period of Norse settlement more than 1,000 years ago. Alfred's subsequent reign, secured by this hard-won stability, turned toward the kind of patient, institution-building work that ultimately justified his later reputation as one of England's greatest rulers, reforming the military organization of Wessex to create a more effective standing defense against future raids, including a system of fortified towns known as buzz. strategically distributed across his kingdom so that no location was ever more than a day's march from a defensible refuge. A network that both protected the population during raids and gradually developed into a system of thriving market towns that contributed significantly to the economic development of Wessex in the following decades. He also invested heavily in learning and literacy, deeply concerned by what he perceived as a decline in scholarship and education across England following decades of Norse disruption, personally sponsoring the translation of important Latin texts into Old English so that they might be more widely accessible, and encouraging a broader revival of learning that would influence English intellectual and religious culture for generations after his death in 899. It would be a mistake, though, to treat the story of the Danelaw purely as one of conquest followed by grudging accommodation, because the subsequent decades reveal a far more interesting and complex process of gradual cultural blending between Norse settlers and their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, a process that unfolded across the 10th century as the Kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred's successors, gradually extended its authority back over the Danelaw territories. A slow, largely successful campaign of reconquest that nonetheless left the distinctive Norse cultural and legal character of the region substantially intact even as it came back under the political authority of a unified English crown. Intermarriage between Norse settlers and the existing Anglo-Saxon population became increasingly common. Norse and Old English, closely related Germanic languages, blended and influenced one another in ways that left a lasting mark on the vocabulary of modern English, contributing everyday words like sky, window, knife, husband, and law itself, along with a great many others, evidence of just how thoroughly and how peacefully, in the end, these two populations came to live alongside and eventually merge with one another, a reminder that the story of the Vikings in England is not simply a story of violence and conquest, however real and significant that violence undeniably was in its initial phases, but ultimately, and perhaps more importantly for the long-term shape of English history and culture, a story of settlement, integration, and the patient blending of two related peoples into what would eventually become a single, shared English identity. Let us turn our attention back now to Ireland, and to the particular character of Norse settlement that developed there, a story that unfolded on a somewhat different timeline and with a somewhat different texture than the English experience we have just spent time with, but that shares the same broad arc from opportunistic raiding through the establishment of fortified bases toward permanent, increasingly sophisticated urban settlement. Dublin, as we touched on briefly earlier tonight, was established as a Norse longfort, a fortified ship encampment, on the River Liffey in the year 841, initially serving simply as a secure base from which raiding expeditions into the Irish interior could be launched and to which they could return between campaigns, and initially, too, subject to periods of abandonment and reoccupation as the fortunes of its Norse inhabitants rose and fell in the complex, often violent political landscape of early medieval Ireland, a landscape divided among numerous small, competing Irish kingdoms whose constant rivalries both created opportunities for Norse intervention as allies or mercenaries and occasionally produced the kind of unified opposition capable of driving Norse settlers out entirely, as happened for a period in the middle of the 10th century before Norse control of the town was re-established. Despite these periodic setbacks, Dublin's fundamentally advantageous position, an excellent natural harbour positioned perfectly for trade and communication across the Irish Sea with Norse settlements in northern England, the Scottish Isles, and the Isle of Man, gradually transformed it from a simple raiding base into one of the wealthiest and most important trading towns in the entire Norse world, a bustling, cosmopolitan settlement where the archaeological record, remarkably well preserved, thanks to the waterlogged conditions of much of the excavated site, reveals evidence of craftsmen working in bone, antler, leather, wood, and metal, producing goods for both local use and export, alongside evidence of extensive long-distance trade connections, imported goods from as far afield as the Rhineland, the Mediterranean, and through the eastern trade networks we will explore later tonight, the Islamic world, with Arabic silver coins, known as dirhams, found in Dublin excavations, providing tangible evidence of just how far-reaching and interconnected Norse trade networks had become by the 10th century. It is important, in discussing Dublin's prosperity, to be honest about one of the less comfortable dimensions of that wealth, which was substantially built upon a thriving trade in enslaved people, with Dublin serving as one of the major hubs through which captives taken in raids across Ireland, Britain, and beyond were bought, sold, and transported onward to markets across the Norse world and into the wider trade networks connecting to the Islamic world, a grim but historically significant reality that later Irish chronicles and other contemporary sources document with a frankness that leaves little room for romanticizing this particular dimension of Norse commercial activity, and one that stands as an important corrective to any account of the Viking Age that focuses only on craftsmanship, seamanship, and trade in more comfortable commodities while glossing over the very real human suffering that underpinned a significant portion of the wealth flowing through towns like Dublin. During this period, the political relationship between Dublin's Norse rulers and the various Irish kingdoms surrounding them evolved considerably across the 9th, 10th, and into the 11th centuries, moving well beyond simple hostility toward a complex pattern of alliance, intermarriage, and mutual entanglement in each other's internal political conflicts, with Norse rulers of Dublin frequently allying with particular Irish kings against their rivals, and Irish kings, in turn, sometimes calling upon Norse military support in their own internal power struggles, a pattern of pragmatic, shifting alliance that reflects the general political culture of early medieval Ireland more broadly rather than representing any special exception created by the presence of Norse settlers. This gradual entanglement culminated, and in some sense reached its dramatic climax, at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, fought just outside Dublin between a coalition led by the Irish High King Brian Boru and a coalition that included the Norse King of Dublin along with allied Irish forces from Leinster, a battle that later Irish tradition, especially in the elaborate saga account known as the Cogad Gedhal Rí Galab, transformed into a grand, almost mythic clash between Irish Christian civilization and Norse pagan invasion, though modern historians generally view this framing with considerable skepticism, since by 1014 the Dublin Norse had been substantially Christianized and thoroughly integrated into Irish political life for generations, and the battle itself was, in reality, a complex affair involving Irish forces fighting on both sides against other Irish and Norse combatants, a political conflict over regional power within Ireland rather than any clean clash of civilizations, however satisfying that later, more mythologized version of events proved to Irish national storytelling in the centuries that followed. Brian Boru achieved victory but was himself killed in the aftermath of the battle, and Dublin, though it suffered in the immediate aftermath, recovered and continued as a significant trading town under Norse-Irish rule for another century and a half, its ultimate political absorption into the wider structures of Irish and, eventually, Anglo-Norman power coming only much later, well beyond the conventional end of the Viking Age that forms the broader frame of our story tonight. The broader pattern of Norse settlement around the Irish Sea, of which Dublin was the most significant but by no means the only example, extended also to the Isle of Man, which developed its own distinctive Norse-influenced culture and its own assembly, the Tynwald, whose name derives directly from the Old Norse Thingvoll, meaning assembly field, and which survives today as one of the oldest continuously operating parliamentary institutions in the world, a small but remarkably durable living link to the Norse governmental traditions we discussed earlier tonight, and to the Hebrides and other islands off the western coast of Scotland, where Norse settlement left a lasting linguistic and cultural imprint still traceable in place names and, according to modern genetic studies, in the ancestry of many present-day inhabitants of these island communities, a quiet, patient legacy of settlement and intermarriage stretching back over 1,000 years to the ships that first began, arriving along these coastlines in the opening decades of the Viking Age. Returning now to the European mainland, and to the Kingdom of the Franks, let us pick up the thread of Norse activity there where we left it earlier tonight, following the pattern of escalating raids up the major river systems through the middle decades of the 9th century toward its most dramatic 9th century culmination, the Great Siege of Paris in 885 and 886, an episode that deserves our unhurried attention both for its own inherent drama and for what it reveals about the increasingly organized, ambitious character that Norse campaigns in Francia had developed by this point in the Viking Age. The siege began in late November of 885, when a very large Norse fleet, later Frankish chroniclers giving figures that were almost certainly exaggerated but that nonetheless convey a genuine sense of the force's substantial scale, sailed up the Seine and arrived before Paris, then a city concentrated primarily on the Isle de la Cite, an island in the river connected to the surrounding banks by two fortified bridges that formed the key to the city's defense, since controlling those bridges meant controlling access both to the city itself and to further passage upriver toward the wealthy territories beyond. The defense of Paris during this extended siege, which stretched on with intermittent fighting across many months, fell primarily to Count Odo, later to become King of West Francia in his own right partly on the strength of the reputation he earned during this defense, along with Bishop Goslin, whose leadership of the city's religious and, in this crisis, also military response, exemplified the increasingly blurred line between ecclesiastical and military authority that characterized Frankish responses to Norse pressure during this period. The defenders held the crucial bridges and fortified towers against repeated Norse assaults through the winter months, and the siege dragged on, with the wider Frankish kingdom slow to mobilize the kind of substantial relief force that might have driven the Norse fleet away entirely, a delay that reflected the same kind of political fragmentation and competing internal priorities that had hampered Frankish responses to Norse raiding throughout the preceding decades. Eventually, the Emperor Charles the Fat, ruling at this point over a reunified but already fragile Carolingian realm, arrived with a relief force in the autumn of 886, but rather than pressing for a decisive military victory over the besieging Norse fleet, he negotiated a settlement that involved paying a substantial tribute and, in a decision that scandalized and humiliated many of his own Frankish subjects and contributed significantly to his loss of political authority and eventual deposition the following year, permitting the Norse fleet to sail further upriver into Burgundy to continue raiding there rather than compelling them to withdraw from Frankish territory entirely, a resolution that satisfied almost no one, and that stands as a particularly vivid illustration of just how difficult it had become for the fragmented, internally divided Carolingian political system to mount an effective unified response to sustained Norse pressure by the closing decades of the 9th century. It was out of this decades-long pattern of raiding, negotiation, and periodic outright warfare along the Seine and the broader Norman coastline that one of the most consequential and enduring outcomes of the entire Viking Age would eventually emerge: the establishment of the Duchy of Normandy, and the story of its founding centers on a Norse leader known to later tradition as Rollo, whose precise origins remain genuinely uncertain in the historical record, with later Norman chroniclers offering various, not entirely consistent accounts of his Scandinavian background, though most modern historians consider it likely he came from Norway or possibly Denmark. Whatever his precise origins, Rollo led a Norse force that had been raiding extensively along the Seine Valley through the final years of the 9th century and into the early 10th, and in the year 911, following a negotiation with the Frankish King Charles the Simple, an agreement was reached, traditionally described as the Treaty of Saint Clair-sur-Epte, though the precise historical details of this agreement are less well documented than later Norman tradition liked to suggest, granting Rollo and his followers formal control over a substantial territory around the Lower Seine, the region that would come to be known as Normandy, meaning literally the land of the Northmen, in exchange for Rollo's nominal submission to the Frankish crown, his conversion to Christianity, and his commitment to defend the territory against further Norse raids from outside, a genuinely elegant solution, from the Frankish perspective, that transformed a persistent external threat into a buffer state whose own vested interest in stability would, in theory at least, help protect the rest of the kingdom from further raiding along that particularly vulnerable stretch of coastline and river. What followed over the subsequent decades was a remarkably thorough process of cultural assimilation that stands in interesting contrast to the more prolonged, distinct Norse cultural identity that persisted for generations in the English Danelaw. The Norse settlers of Normandy, though they arrived as conquerors and initially maintained their own language and customs, intermarried extensively with the existing Frankish population, gradually adopted the French language, Frankish Christian religious practice, and the broader feudal political culture of the surrounding Frankish kingdoms, so thoroughly that within just a few generations the descendants of Rollo's Norse warriors had become, culturally and linguistically, essentially indistinguishable from their Frankish neighbors, retaining from their Norse heritage primarily a distinctive military tradition, a particular talent for cavalry warfare and castle building that Norman lords would put to extraordinarily consequential use in the following centuries, and a certain enduring reputation for ambition and martial energy that chroniclers of the time frequently commented upon. It is a remarkable historical irony, worth sitting with for a moment, that this thoroughly assimilated French-speaking Christian territory, founded by Norse raiders barely more than a century and a half earlier, would go on to produce William the Conqueror, whose invasion and conquest of England in 1066 we will examine in careful detail toward the end of our journey tonight, an invasion that, in a genuinely striking historical circularity, brought descendants of Norse settlers in France into conflict with, and eventually into rule over, the descendants of Norse and Anglo-Saxon settlers in England, two branches of a shared Norse heritage meeting again on the battlefield more than 2.5 centuries after the first Norse ships had appeared off the English and Frankish coasts. A fitting and quietly fascinating illustration of just how far-reaching and how long the consequences of the Viking Age would ultimately prove to be across the political landscape of medieval Europe. While Norse energy through much of the 9th century flowed primarily westward and southward toward the British Isles and continental Europe in the raids and settlements we have spent so much of tonight exploring, a different and in some ways even more remarkable kind of expansion was unfolding simultaneously across the open waters of the North Atlantic, a story not primarily of conquest and raiding but of genuine exploration and settlement of previously uninhabited, or nearly uninhabited, land. Beginning with the discovery and colonization of Iceland, a large, dramatically volcanic island sitting isolated in the northern Atlantic, roughly a week's sail from Norway under favorable conditions, that would, across the following century, become home to a thriving and culturally distinctive Norse society whose literary output, the great Icelandic sagas, would eventually preserve for us some of the richest and most detailed surviving accounts of Norse life, belief, and history from the entire Viking Age. The settlement of Iceland, traditionally dated as beginning in the 870s, though some archaeological evidence suggests activity possibly slightly earlier, unfolded according to later Icelandic tradition, preserved in the medieval text known as the Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, as a wave of organized migration driven substantially by political circumstances back in Norway, where the ambitious king Harald Fairhair, whose own consequential story of unification we will return to shortly, was in the process of consolidating control over a Norway that had previously been divided among numerous smaller, independent chieftains, a process of centralization that many established chieftains and free farmers, unwilling to submit to Harald's growing royal authority and the taxation and reduced independence it implied, found deeply unwelcome, prompting a significant number of them to gather their households, their livestock, and their portable wealth and set sail westward in search of land, where they might establish new farms and new communities free from the reach of any king. Whatever the precise balance of causes, and modern historians generally treat this single explanatory narrative with some caution, recognizing that population pressure, the simple lure of good unclaimed farmland, and ordinary economic opportunity likely played roles alongside any specific political grievance against Harald's centralizing ambitions. The practical result was a substantial and remarkably well-documented wave of settlement that, within roughly 60 years, according to the Landnámabók's account, had claimed essentially all the habitable coastal and lowland areas of the island, organized into individual farms whose boundaries, according to tradition, were often established according to the distance a person could walk in a day while carrying fire, or the extent of land a released animal, laden with symbolic significance, might wander before finally coming to rest. The society that developed in Iceland across the following generations retained the fundamental social structures we discussed earlier in our journey tonight: farms organized around extended households, free farmers gathering periodically to settle disputes and maintain communal law, but developed these traditions in a particularly notable direction, since Iceland, uniquely among Norse settlements of this period, developed no monarchy at all, instead organizing itself as a kind of decentralized commonwealth governed by the Althing, an annual assembly, established traditionally in the year 930, that gathered free farmers and chieftains from across the island at a dramatic natural site called Thingvellir, a great rift valley marking the boundary between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates, where laws were recited aloud from memory by an official called the law speaker. Since the Icelandic legal tradition remained substantially oral for its first century and more, disputes were formally argued and adjudicated, and the social, political, and legal business of the entire island community was conducted over a period of roughly 2 weeks each summer, a remarkable early experiment in decentralized, assembly-based governance that modern scholars of political history often point to as one of the more genuinely distinctive and interesting institutional achievements to emerge anywhere in the Norse world. This same period of Icelandic settlement also produced, in the following century, a genuine constitutional crisis and its remarkably peaceful resolution that deserves a few unhurried moments of our attention tonight, because it illustrates something important about the pragmatic, consensus-oriented character of Norse legal culture at its best. As Iceland's population grew across the 10th century, a growing minority had converted to Christianity, whether through contact with Christian communities abroad or through the influence of Christian settlers, including a number of Icelanders with Irish or British Christian ancestry among the original settling population, while the majority of the population continued to observe the traditional Norse religious practices we spent time with earlier tonight, and by the year 999 or 1000, this Religious division had grown serious enough to threaten the unity and stability of the entire Icelandic Commonwealth, with Christian and pagan factions reportedly on the verge of declaring themselves under separate laws entirely, a genuinely dangerous prospect for a small, isolated island society dependent on shared legal and social cohesion for its basic functioning. The resolution, according to the saga accounts that preserve this episode, came through the law speaker of the time, a man named Thorgeir, who, after a day and night of solitary contemplation lying beneath a cloak at Thingvellir, emerged to announce a decision, adopted by the assembly, that Iceland would formally convert to Christianity as its official public religion, with baptism required of all, while permitting, at least for some initial period, the continued private practice of certain traditional customs, including private pagan worship conducted discreetly, a pragmatic compromise that avoided civil war and preserved the unity of the young Icelandic Commonwealth, a genuinely remarkable episode of peaceful conflict resolution achieved through patient deliberation and a shared commitment to communal stability over factional victory, one that stands as a quiet but meaningful testament to the sophistication of Norse legal and political culture at what might otherwise have been one of its most dangerously fractious moments. From Iceland, Norse exploration and settlement continued to push further west, into territory even more remote and even more challenging than Iceland itself had presented, and this next chapter of expansion is associated above all with one particularly vivid and, in the surviving sources, somewhat notorious figure, Eric Thorvaldsson, known to history as Eric the Red, whose story, as preserved in the Icelandic sagas, offers us a genuinely human, if not always entirely flattering window into the kind of restless, sometimes violent temperament that could drive a man to push settlement into ever more remote and dangerous corners of the known world. According to the saga accounts, Eric's family had already been exiled once from Norway to Iceland following a killing his father had been involved in, and Eric himself, some years after settling in Iceland, became embroiled in his own series of violent disputes with neighbors, ultimately resulting in further killings and his own sentence of outlawry from Iceland for a period of 3 years, a legal punishment that, rather than being a simple prison sentence in the modern sense, meant Eric was formally stripped of legal protection within Icelandic society and effectively required to leave the island entirely for the duration of his sentence, under threat of being killed with impunity by anyone he encountered should he remain. Rather than seeking refuge back in Norway or elsewhere in the established Norse world, Eric chose to sail further west, into waters that Icelandic tradition held contained land previously sighted, though not thoroughly explored or settled, by earlier sailors who had been blown off course, and across his period of exile, traditionally dated to the early 980s, Eric explored and mapped a substantial stretch of the coastline of what we now call Greenland, a vast, largely ice-covered landmass whose southwestern coastal fjords, though harsh by almost any ordinary agricultural standard, offered patches of grassland sufficient, in the relatively favorable climatic conditions of this period that we discussed earlier tonight, to support the kind of pastoral farming, principally sheep, goats, and cattle, that Norse settlers were accustomed to practicing. Upon his return to Iceland at the end of his exile, Eric promoted this newly explored territory to prospective settlers under the notably optimistic name Greenland, a piece of what later chroniclers and even some of Eric's own contemporaries suspected was rather generous marketing for a land that was, in reality, considerably more challenging and considerably less green than its name suggested, though the more charitable and probably more accurate explanation offered by modern historians is simply that the southwestern coastal fjords Eric had explored genuinely did offer grazing land green enough, at least in the relatively favorable climatic window of the period, to justify the name for the specific areas he intended to settle, whatever the character of the vastly larger and more forbidding ice-covered interior of the island beyond. The settlement expedition that followed, traditionally dated to around 985, involved a substantial fleet, the saga's recording numbers in the range of 25 ships setting out from Iceland, though only about 14 are said to have completed the crossing successfully, the others lost or turned back amid the genuinely dangerous open ocean conditions of the voyage. And the settlers who did arrive established 2 main settlement areas along the southwestern Greenlandic coast, conventionally referred to by later historians as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, despite both actually being located on the island's western coast, that would grow, at their peak, to support a Norse population estimated by archaeologists at somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, spread across several hundred individual farms, sustaining themselves through a combination of pastoral farming, hunting of seals and other marine mammals, and the harvesting of walrus ivory, a genuinely valuable export commodity that connected this remote settlement to the broader Norse and European trade networks we have discussed throughout tonight's journey. Walrus tusks from Greenland reaching markets as far away as continental Europe and providing the Greenlandic settlers with the imported goods, timber in particular, being scarce on an island largely devoid of substantial forest, that their harsh environment could not itself supply. The Norse settlement of Greenland persisted for several centuries, developing its own churches, including eventually a small cathedral and even, for a period, its own resident bishop, appointed from Norway as part of the broader integration of Greenland into the structures of the Christian church that gradually extended across the Norse world following the conversions we discussed earlier tonight. But the settlement's ultimate fate, its gradual decline and eventual complete disappearance, sometime in the 15th century, remains one of the more genuinely poignant and still not entirely resolved mysteries of the entire Norse Atlantic story, a slow fading rather than any single dramatic catastrophe, with the most recent archaeological and climatological research pointing toward a combination of factors, a gradual cooling of the North Atlantic climate beginning in the 13th and 14th centuries that made the marginal pastoral farming the settlement depended upon increasingly difficult to sustain, declining trade connections with Norway and Iceland as European demand for walrus ivory fell following increased access to African elephant ivory through expanding trade routes, and possibly increasing competition and conflict with Inuit populations who were themselves expanding into the same coastal regions during this period, all combining, across a slow decline stretching over generations rather than any single conclusive event, to bring an end to Europe's most remote medieval settlement, a quiet fading away, farm by farm, family by family, that stands as a gentle, melancholy reminder of just how fragile even the most determined and skillfully adapted human settlement can prove to be at the very edges of what a changing world will allow to survive. It was from this Greenlandic settlement that Norse exploration reached its furthest westward extent, arriving, in a genuinely remarkable historical achievement that would not be matched by any other European seafaring culture for another 5 centuries, at the shores of North America itself, and the story of this discovery, preserved primarily in 2 somewhat differing Icelandic sagas, the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, centers on Eric the Red's own son, Leif Erikson, whose voyage westward from Greenland, traditionally dated to around the year 1000, brought Norse sailors to a stretch of North American coastline that the sagas call Vinland, a name most commonly interpreted as meaning wineland, apparently in reference to wild grapes the explorers reportedly found growing there, though the precise location and even the correct translation of the name remain subjects of genuine ongoing scholarly discussion. According to the saga traditions, the actual first sighting of this new land may have come slightly earlier still, attributed to a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who, sailing from Iceland toward Greenland to visit his father, was blown off course by unfavorable winds and sighted an unfamiliar, forested coastline considerably to the south and west of where Greenland ought to have been, but who, notably, chose not to land and explore this new territory, continuing instead on his intended voyage to Greenland, a decision that later, once his account of the sighting became known, is said to have prompted some criticism of his lack of curiosity from among his fellow Norse settlers, criticism that Leif Erikson, upon hearing Bjarni's account some years later, resolved not to repeat, purchasing Bjarni's ship and organizing an expedition specifically to locate, explore, and land upon this westward territory that Bjarni had merely glimpsed from a distance. Leif's expedition, and the subsequent voyages undertaken by other members of his family and other Greenlandic settlers over the following years, explored and gave names to several distinct stretches of this North American coastline, Helgeland, meaning land of flat stones, generally identified by modern scholars with Baffin Island, Markland, meaning forest land, generally identified with the coast of Labrador, and Vinland itself, the southernmost and most extensively explored of the 3, whose precise location has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, though the most compelling and, crucially, the only archaeologically confirmed Norse site in North America lies at Lance Aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, excavated beginning in the 1960s by Norwegian archaeologists Helga and Stein Ingstad, whose discovery there of the remains of Norse-style turf buildings, an iron smithy, and artifacts including a bronze cloak pin and a spindle whorl, the latter, suggesting the presence of women among the settlement's inhabitants, provided the first, and remains the only definitively confirmed physical evidence of Norse presence anywhere in North America, a genuinely thrilling archaeological confirmation of what had, until that discovery, remained a story known only from saga tradition whose historical reliability, like so much of the saga material we have drawn upon throughout tonight's journey, had been subject to considerable scholarly skepticism. The Norse settlement at Vinland, however, whether at Lance aux Meadows itself or at other, still undiscovered locations further south that the sagas suggest may also have been explored or briefly settled, proved considerably less durable than the settlements in Iceland or even Greenland, and the sagas attribute this failure primarily to conflict with the indigenous population the Norse encountered there, referred to in the sagas by the term skrælings, a word whose precise connotations remain debated among scholars, but that was applied by the Norse to the indigenous peoples of North America they encountered, initial contact and trade between the two groups giving way, according to the saga accounts, to violence and conflict serious enough that the Norse settlers, recognizing themselves to be vastly outnumbered and operating at the very furthest extent of a supply and support network stretching back through Greenland and Iceland to Norway itself, ultimately concluded that permanent settlement in Vinland was not sustainable, and the settlement, whatever its exact extent and duration, which archaeological evidence suggests may have been quite brief, was abandoned, leaving Norse activity in North America as a fascinating but ultimately limited and temporary episode rather than the beginning of any lasting colonial presence, a genuinely remarkable first contact between European and indigenous American peoples that occurred nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, and one that, precisely because it left so little lasting trace and so little immediate consequence for the broader course of world history, offers us tonight a particularly quiet, contemplative note to sit with, a reminder that historical significance is not always measured in immediate consequence, and that this remarkable, lonely outpost of turf buildings on a windswept Newfoundland coastline, inhabited briefly by people who had sailed further west than any other Europeans of their age, stands as one of the most evocative and genuinely humbling achievements of the entire Norse expansion we have been following together across so much of tonight's long, unhurried journey. While the western expansion of the Norse world, the raids and settlements across the British Isles, Francia, and the North Atlantic that have occupied so much of our attention tonight, tends to dominate popular understanding of the Viking Age, an equally significant and in some ways even more geographically extensive pattern of Norse activity was unfolding simultaneously to the east, across the river systems of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and southward toward the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the great markets of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, a story centered on a particular group of Norse traders, warriors, and eventually rulers known to history as the Rus, a name whose precise etymology remains debated among scholars, though it is generally believed to derive from an early Scandinavian term, and that would eventually give its name to Russia itself, a linguistic legacy every bit as significant, in its own way, as the place names scattered across the English Danelaw that we discussed earlier tonight. Norse traders, primarily it seems originating from what is now Sweden, had begun establishing trading contacts along the river systems of Eastern Europe well before the conventional start of the Viking Age in the West, drawn by the opportunity to trade furs, amber, and enslaved captives for the silver flowing north from the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate through trade networks connecting to the Caspian Sea and beyond, and by the 9th century these trading contacts had developed into a more permanent and more politically significant presence, with Norse leaders establishing fortified trading settlements at strategic points along the major river routes, most notably at Novgorod in the north and somewhat later, at Kiev, positioned further south along the Dnieper River, which offered a crucial route connecting the Baltic Sea, through a demanding portage across watersheds and a long river journey, all the way to the Black Sea and, from there, to the wealth and sophistication of the Byzantine Empire itself. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, a later medieval text compiled by Christian monks that provides our primary, though not entirely straightforward or uncontested, source for the early history of the Rus, a Norse leader named Rurik was invited by feuding local Slavic and Finnic tribes around the year 862 to come and establish order and governance among them, founding what would become the ruling dynasty of the early Rus state, a narrative that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, which modern historians treat with appropriate scholarly caution given the chronicle's much later composition and its own particular political motivations, reflects a broader and better documented pattern across this period of Norse traders and warriors establishing themselves as a ruling and military elite among the Slavic and Finnic populations of the region, intermarrying with local populations, and gradually, across the following generations, becoming culturally assimilated into the broader Slavic linguistic and cultural world even as they retained, for a period, their own distinct identity and their crucial control over the long-distance trade routes that formed the economic foundation of the emerging Rus state. It was this same river trade network that brought Norse warriors and traders into direct and sustained contact with the Byzantine Empire, the sophisticated, wealthy Christian successor state to the Eastern Roman Empire centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, a city so far beyond anything the Norse world could offer in terms of scale, wealth, and architectural grandeur that Old Norse sources refer to it simply as Miklagard, the Great City, and this contact took multiple forms across the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, including periodic outright military conflict, most notably a series of Rus attacks on Constantinople itself across the 9th and 10th centuries that met with mixed success against the formidable defenses and the famous incendiary weapon known as Greek fire that Byzantine forces employed to devastating effect against attacking ships, but that also, over time, gave way to increasingly formalized diplomatic and commercial relationships, treaties, regulating trade between the Rus and the Byzantine Empire being negotiated and recorded on multiple occasions across this period, establishing the terms under which Rus merchants could trade in Constantinople and defining mutual rights and obligations between the two powers. Perhaps the most historically significant and enduring product of this Eastern contact, though, was military and eventually broader cultural in character rather than purely commercial, the formation, beginning in the later 10th century, of the Varangian Guard, an elite military unit within the Byzantine imperial army composed substantially of Norse, and later increasingly of English and other Northern European warriors who traveled east specifically to serve, for substantial pay and considerable prestige, as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, a service that attracted ambitious young Norse warriors from across Scandinavia across the following century and more, drawn by the genuinely extraordinary wealth and status that successful service in this most elite of Byzantine military units could provide, wealth that, brought back to Scandinavia by veterans who survived their service and returned home, is reflected in runic memorial inscriptions scattered across Sweden in particular, stones raised by families to commemorate sons and husbands who had traveled east, served in Miklagard, and either returned with tales and treasure or, in many recorded cases, died far from home in Byzantine service, their memory preserved in carved runes on stones that still stand today in the Swedish countryside, quiet, weathered testimonials to just how far the ambitions and the journeys of Norse men and women during this remarkable period could ultimately reach. Connecting the fjords and farms of Scandinavia we spent so much time with at the beginning of tonight's journey to the golden domes and marble palaces of the greatest city in the medieval Christian world. Having followed Norse expansion across such a remarkable span of the medieval world tonight, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, from Greenland to the gates of Constantinople, let us turn our attention back now to Scandinavia itself, and to the slower, quieter, but ultimately equally consequential process by which the scattered, competing chieftaincies and petty kingdoms we discussed at the very beginning of our journey gradually consolidated, across these same centuries, into the larger, more centralized kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden that would emerge by the close of the Viking Age, a process that unfolded unevenly across the three regions and that involved its own share of ambitious, forceful, and occasionally quite ruthless individual rulers whose stories are worth our patient attention. In Norway, this process of unification is traditionally associated above all with Harald Fairhair, whose ambitious campaign to bring the numerous independent chieftaincies of Norway under his own singular authority we touched upon earlier tonight in connection with the settlement of Iceland, and whose reign, traditionally dated across the closing decades of the 9th century into the early 10th, though the precise chronology remains genuinely uncertain given the limitations of the sources available to us, is remembered in later saga tradition as having been sparked by a rather charming, if almost certainly legendary, romantic motivation, a woman named Gyda who reportedly refused Harald's marriage proposal, declaring she would not marry a man who ruled only a small portion of Norway, prompting Harald to vow he would neither cut nor comb his hair until he had made himself king of the entire country, a vow that, according to tradition, he fulfilled after a decisive victory at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, after which he finally had his hair cut and combed, earning the epithet Fairhair that has attached to his memory ever since. Whatever the precise historical accuracy of this romantic origin story, which modern historians generally treat as later saga embellishment rather than reliable history, the broader pattern it reflects, of a single ambitious ruler using military force and shifting alliances to gradually bring the independent chieftaincies of Norway under unified royal authority, provoking, as we discussed earlier, Significant emigration among chieftains and free farmers unwilling to accept this new centralized authority does appear to reflect a genuine and historically significant process of political consolidation that unfolded across Norway during this period, even if the precise details and timeline remain considerably less certain than the confident narrative of later saga tradition might suggest. In Denmark, a parallel process of consolidation is associated with the Jelling dynasty, and particularly with a king named Harald Bluetooth, whose reign across the middle decades of the 10th century saw the effective unification of Denmark under a single royal authority commemorated in a genuinely remarkable surviving monument, the larger of two great carved runestones erected at Jelling, which bears an inscription in which Harald proclaims himself as having won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and significantly, as having made the Danes Christian, a monument that stands today as one of the most important and evocative surviving pieces of direct, contemporary Norse royal self-presentation from the entire Viking Age, its carved images, including one of the earliest surviving depictions of Christ in Scandinavian art, standing as physical, tangible evidence of the profound religious and political transformation that Harald's reign oversaw, the formal top-down conversion of the Danish kingdom from the Norse pagan religious world we spent time with earlier tonight toward Christianity, a transformation that, as it happened or would happen across the Norse world more broadly, from Iceland's peaceful assembly-negotiated conversion to Guthrum's baptism under Alfred's sponsorship in England, brought Scandinavia increasingly within the shared religious and political framework of Christian Europe, even as older beliefs and practices persisted for generations longer in private practice and popular custom than the formal, official adoption of Christianity by royal decree might suggest. It is worth noting, as a small point of modern cultural trivia that nonetheless illustrates the surprisingly long reach of this history into the present day, that the wireless communication technology known as Bluetooth takes its name directly from this Harald, chosen by the Swedish engineers who developed the technology in the 1990s specifically because Harald had been renowned for uniting and facilitating communication between disparate, previously divided Danish factions, a whimsical but genuinely intentional homage connecting a 10th century Danish king to a piece of everyday 21st century technology in a way that Harald himself could scarcely have imagined. Of all the rulers to emerge from this long process of Scandinavian political consolidation, none achieved a scale of power and territorial reach quite comparable to Knut, known to history as Knut the Great, whose reign in the early 11th century brought England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden under the authority of a single ruler for the first and, as it would turn out, only time in medieval history, a genuinely remarkable political achievement that deserves our careful, unhurried attention as one of the true high points of Norse political power before the gradual winding down of the Viking Age that we will trace across the final chapters of tonight's journey. Knut's path to power began amid a renewed period of intensive Danish raiding against England that had resumed across the final decades of the 10th century, a resumption driven substantially by the ambitions of Knut's own father, Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, who led increasingly large and increasingly successful campaigns against an English kingdom that, under the long but troubled reign of King Athelred, remembered rather unkindly by history under the epithet, the unready, a modern mistranslation of an Old English term that actually meant something closer to poorly counseled or ill-advised, proved unable to mount an effective sustained defense, resorting instead to the same strategy of paying tribute, the Danegeld we mentioned briefly in connection with Francia earlier tonight, that had proven so counterproductive in encouraging further raids wherever it had been employed across the Norse world. Ethelred's reign was further marked by a genuinely disastrous decision in 1002, when, amid fears of treachery among Danish settlers in England, he ordered a massacre of Danish inhabitants across his kingdom, an event that, whatever its precise scale, which is genuinely difficult to establish with confidence from the surviving sources, is generally understood to have significantly escalated the conflict with Denmark and to have provided Sweyn Forkbeard with a further, deeply personal motivation for the intensified campaigns of conquest he pursued across the following decade, campaigns that culminated in 1013 with Sweyn's forces achieving a level of success sufficient to force Athelred into exile in Normandy and to have Sweyn himself acclaimed as King of England, though Sweyn's own reign proved exceptionally brief, as he died suddenly just a few weeks after achieving this culmination of his ambitions, in early 1014. Following Sweyn's death, the English nobility initially recalled Athelred from his Norman exile, but a period of renewed conflict and considerable political instability followed across the next several years, involving Athelred, his son and eventual successor Edmund Ironside, whose brief but militarily impressive resistance against continued Danish pressure earned him his epithet, and Nut himself, now pursuing his own claim to the English throne as his father's heir, a conflict that was eventually resolved, following Edmund Ironside's own death in late 1016, with Nut's recognition as King of all England, a position he then worked across the following years to consolidate through a combination of calculated marriage, taking as his wife Emma of Normandy, the widow of the very King Athelred he had displaced, a match that helped secure his legitimacy among the English nobility and simultaneously strengthened his diplomatic position with the powerful Duchy of Normandy, and through careful, generally quite pragmatic governance that worked with, rather than against, existing English institutions and the existing English nobility, incorporating capable English administrators into his government and largely respecting existing English law and custom rather than imposing Danish institutions wholesale, an approach that stands in interesting contrast to the more purely conquest-oriented character of the earlier great heathen army campaigns we discussed earlier tonight, and that reflects a more mature, more genuinely governance-minded phase of Norse political ambition by this later stage of the Viking Age. Knut's power extended well beyond England itself. Following the death of his brother Harold, Knut also became King of Denmark in 1018, and through a combination of military campaigning and diplomatic maneuvering across the 1020s, he extended his authority over Norway as well, briefly bringing the entire North Sea world, England, Denmark, and Norway, along with a degree of influence over parts of Sweden, under his single rule, an achievement substantial enough that modern historians often refer to this brief but genuinely remarkable political construction as Knut's North Sea Empire, though it is worth noting, in keeping with our careful, patient approach to this history tonight, that this empire was held together more by Knut's own personal authority, prestige, and network of alliances and marriages than by any deep institutional integration between its constituent kingdoms, which retained their own separate laws, administrations, and identities throughout, governed for Knut in his periodic absences by regents and earls whose loyalty, however carefully cultivated, remained ultimately personal rather than institutional in character. This structural reality helps explain why Knut's North Sea Empire, for all its impressive scale, proved relatively short-lived following his death in 1035, fragmenting fairly quickly amid succession disputes among his sons and the broader instability that so often followed the death of a medieval ruler whose authority had rested so heavily on personal prestige and carefully maintained alliance rather than deeper, more durable institutional structures, a pattern that would repeat itself with even more dramatic and historically consequential results in the final major episode of Viking Age political ambition that we will turn our attention to next, the story of Harald Hardrada and the dramatic events of the year 1066 that are generally understood to mark the effective conclusion of the entire Viking Age. Among the many colorful and ambitious figures who populate the long history we have been exploring together tonight, few led lives quite as varied, dramatic, and far-ranging as Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, a name generally translated as Harald the Hard Ruler or Harald the Ruthless, whose own extraordinary career, spanning service in the elite Varangian Guard we discussed earlier tonight all the way through to his eventual death on English soil in 1066, offers a fitting, if genuinely dramatic, capstone to our long journey through the Viking Age, and whose story deserves our patient attention even as we recognize we are, with his death, approaching the natural conclusion of the particular historical period we have spent so many hours exploring together tonight. Harold's early life was shaped decisively by exile and displacement, as a teenage participant in the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, fighting alongside his half-brother, the Norwegian King Olaf Haraldsson, later venerated as Saint Olaf following his death in that same battle and his subsequent status as Norway's patron saint. A battle in which the young Harald was wounded and forced to flee into exile following Olaf's defeat and death at the hands of rival Norwegian nobles allied with Knut, whose North Sea Empire we discussed in the previous chapter was, at this point, extending its influence into Norway itself. This early defeat and exile sent Harald first to Kievan Rus, where he served for a period among the retinue of Prince Yaroslav the Wise, and then, in a career move that echoes the pattern of ambitious young Norse warriors we discussed earlier tonight in connection with the eastern trade routes and the Byzantine world, onward to Constantinople itself, where he joined the prestigious Varangian Guard and served the Byzantine emperors across an extended and, according to later saga accounts, admittedly prone to some exaggeration of his exploits, remarkably eventful period of military campaigning across the eastern Mediterranean, Sicily, and even, according to some accounts, as far as the Holy Land, accumulating over the course of this extended eastern service a truly substantial personal fortune in the form of Byzantine gold and other treasure, wealth that he arranged, with characteristic shrewdness, to have transported securely back toward Scandinavia even while he continued his service abroad, mindful that such wealth would prove essential to any future ambitions he might pursue back in his homeland. Harold eventually returned to Scandinavia in the late 1040s, using his accumulated fortune and his by then considerable military reputation to first secure a position as co-ruler of Norway alongside his nephew Magnus, and then, following Magnus' death, as sole king of Norway, a position he held and defended, often through genuinely ruthless suppression of internal rivals and dissent, a ruthlessness that, whatever its moral cost, does appear to justify at least part of the epithet later attached to his memory, across roughly 2 decades of rule marked by ambitious, though ultimately unsuccessful, attempts to also claim the throne of Denmark, a goal that occupied much of his military energy and that he was never able to fully achieve despite years of campaigning against the Danish king Svein Estridsson. It was in 1066, in the final year of his long and eventful life, that Harold made the decision that would prove fatal both to himself and, in its broader consequences, to the entire era of large-scale Scandinavian royal ambition in England that this book has spent so much time exploring tonight, accepting an invitation from Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the newly crowned English king Harold Godwinson, to invade England and press a somewhat tenuous claim to the English throne that Harold based on an earlier agreement of disputed historical validity between Knut's immediate successors, and assembling a substantial fleet and army that sailed to England and, in September of 1066, achieved an initial significant victory over local English forces at the Battle of Fulford, near York, before advancing to accept the formal submission of the city itself, a victory that, however, proved to be the very last significant triumph of Norse arms on English soil, because King Harold Godwinson, upon receiving news of the Norwegian invasion, force-marched his own army northward from the south of England with a speed and determination that caught Harold and his forces entirely by surprise, arriving to confront the invading Norwegian army at Stamford Bridge, just outside York, on the 25th of September 1066, a battle whose events and consequences deserve, and will receive, the careful, unhurried attention of the chapter that follows this one, as we approach, together, the conventional close of the entire remarkable historical period we have spent tonight so patiently exploring. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought on that late September day in 1066 just outside the city of York, unfolded, according to the somewhat later and admittedly not entirely certain accounts that survive to us, primarily through the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the considerably more elaborate, though written well over a century later and therefore treated with appropriate scholarly caution, account preserved in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, as a genuinely decisive and, for the Norwegian forces, involved catastrophic engagement, and it is worth spending some careful, unhurried time with its details tonight, both because of its inherent historical significance as the conventional closing bracket of the entire Viking Age we have spent this long night exploring, and because its particular circumstances illustrate rather vividly the kind of dramatic reversal of fortune that could attend even the most experienced and successful of medieval military commanders. According to the traditional account, Harald Hardrada's forces, having secured York and received its formal submission just days earlier, believed themselves to be in a position of considerable security, sufficiently confident, apparently, that a significant portion of the Norwegian army, and crucially much of their armor, had been left behind at their ships at Rickall, some distance from Stamford Bridge itself, when the unexpected sight of a large approaching army, initially hoped by some of Harold's men to be additional English forces coming to formally submit to their new arrangement with the Norwegian king, resolved instead into the unmistakable and thoroughly unwelcome reality of King Harold Godwinson's own army, having completed its extraordinarily rapid march north from southern England in a matter of days, arriving at Stamford Bridge ready and determined to fight rather than negotiate. The Norwegian forces, caught significantly underprepared, with substantial numbers of their men lacking the armor that had been left behind at the ships and with no time to send effectively for reinforcement before battle was joined, nonetheless fought with the kind of determined resistance that Norse warrior culture, shaped across the centuries by the values of courage and reputation we discussed earlier tonight in connection with Norse religious belief, would have demanded, and later. Tradition preserves a particularly vivid, if likely somewhat embellished, episode in which a single anonymous Norwegian warrior is said to have held the narrow bridge itself against the entire advancing English army for a considerable period, cutting down numerous attackers before finally being overcome, buying crucial time for the main Norwegian force to organize itself into a defensive formation on the far side of the river. A story that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, captures something of the genuine desperate courage that this battle apparently demanded of its participants. Despite this resistance, the battle turned decisively against the Norwegian forces as the day progressed. Harald Hardrada himself, fighting according to tradition without armor and in a state of considerable battle fury, was killed by an arrow to the throat at a crucial point in the engagement, a death that removed the Norwegian army's central commanding presence at a decisive moment, and the battle, which had already been going badly for the underprepared and outmaneuvered Norwegian forces, collapsed thereafter into a rout, with English sources recording that the Norwegian fleet, which had arrived at the start of the campaign requiring some 300 ships to transport the invading force, required only a small fraction of that number, some accounts suggesting as few as 24 vessels, to carry home the survivors of what had been, at the campaign's outset, one of the largest and most ambitious Norwegian military expeditions of the entire era, a devastating and comprehensive defeat that effectively ended, in a single afternoon, both Harald Hardrada's own long and remarkable career and, in a broader sense that later historians have generally recognized even if contemporaries could not yet have fully appreciated it, the entire long tradition of large-scale Scandinavian royal military ambition directed at conquering English territory that had, in one form or another, shaped English political history for the better part of 3 centuries since that first shocking morning at Lindisfarne that opened our journey together so many hours ago tonight. The bitter irony of this outcome, and it is an irony worth sitting with for a quiet moment before we move onward, is that King Harold Godwinson's hard-won and genuinely impressive victory at Stamford Bridge left his own army exhausted, depleted, and stationed in the north of England at precisely the moment when a second, entirely separate invasion force, that of William, Duke of Normandy, the descendant, as we discussed earlier tonight, of Rollo's Norse settlers who had themselves arrived in Francia as raiders and conquerors barely more than a century and a half earlier, was landing on the southern coast of England, forcing Harold to immediately reverse his exhausted army's march and hurry south to confront this new threat, arriving at the field that would become known to history as the Battle of Hastings with forces that had already endured an exhausting campaign and a grueling march of hundreds of miles in the span of just a few weeks, circumstances that many historians consider to have significantly, perhaps decisively, contributed to Harold's own defeat and death at Hastings on the 14th of October, less than 3 weeks after his triumph at Stamford Bridge, an outcome that, whatever else it represents in the broader sweep of English and European history, brought a Norse-descended ruler to the English throne after all, not through the direct Scandinavian conquest that Harald Hardrada had attempted, but through the thoroughly assimilated French-speaking descendants of Norse settlement in Normandy, a genuinely fitting, if characteristically indirect and complicated, final flourish to the long, intertwined story of Norse ambition and English history that we have spent so much of tonight's journey exploring together. As we draw our long journey tonight toward its close, following, as any patient and thorough history should, the story past the great dramatic events themselves and into the quieter, longer afterglow of legacy and consequence, it is worth spending some unhurried time considering just how much of the world the Norse touched during these roughly 2.5 centuries of expansion, raiding, trade, and settlement continues to carry their imprint, often in ways so thoroughly woven into the ordinary fabric of modern life that they pass entirely unnoticed by people going about their daily business with no particular awareness of just how far back into this distant, seafaring past certain threads of their present world actually reach. Language offers perhaps the most pervasive and least visible of these legacies, and we touched briefly earlier tonight on the substantial contribution that Old Norse made to the vocabulary of modern English, a contribution considerably deeper and more extensive than most casual speakers of English likely realize, encompassing not just the place names scattered across eastern and northern England that we discussed in connection with the Danelaw, but a great many of the most basic, commonly used words in the entire English language, including such fundamental terms as sky, egg, knife, window, husband, both, same, they, their, and them, along with hundreds of others, a linguistic legacy so deeply embedded in the ordinary, everyday texture of English speech that it requires genuine historical excavation to notice at all, each of these small words a quiet, easily overlooked monument to the centuries of contact, conflict, and eventual peaceful coexistence between Norse settlers and their Anglo-Saxon neighbors that we traced earlier in tonight's journey. Beyond language, the Norse left behind an extensive legacy in the realm of political and legal institutions, most visibly in the assembly-based traditions we encountered in connection with Iceland's Althing and the Isle of Man's Tynwald, both institutions that survive, remarkably, into the present day in some meaningfully continuous form, but also more diffusely in the broader English legal and administrative tradition, where the very concept and vocabulary of law, itself a Norse-derived word, along with various specific legal terms and procedures that entered English administrative practice through the Danelaw and through the broader centuries of Anglo-Norse interaction, continue to influence the development of English common law long after the specific political circumstances of Viking Age settlement had faded into history. Modern genetic research, drawing on the increasingly sophisticated tools of population genetics that have become available to historians and archaeologists only in recent decades, has further confirmed what place names and historical documents had already suggested, revealing measurable Norse genetic contributions to modern populations across a wide arc of territory the Norse once raided, traded with, and settled from Orkney and Shetland, where the genetic legacy of Norse settlement remains particularly pronounced through much of coastal and eastern England, Ireland, and even into parts of Russia and Ukraine, a genuinely tangible biological thread connecting millions of people living today to the seafaring farmers and traders we have spent tonight's long journey getting to know. The Norse also left behind, in a more purely cultural and imaginative sense, an enormously rich body of literature and mythology that has continued to influence Western art, literature, and popular culture across the centuries since the Viking Age itself drew to its close. The Icelandic sagas we have drawn upon so extensively throughout tonight's account standing as genuinely significant achievements of medieval European literature in their own right, prized for their spare, understated prose style and their psychologically nuanced portrayal of complex human characters navigating questions of honor, fate, and family obligation, while Norse mythology itself, the gods and cosmology we spent careful time with earlier tonight, has continued to resonate through subsequent centuries of European culture, influencing everything from the operas of Richard Wagner in the 19th century, which drew extensively on Norse and broader Germanic mythological material, to the modern fantasy literature of J.R.R. Tolkien, whose deep scholarly engagement with Old Norse language and literature profoundly shaped the mythology and cosmology of his own enormously influential fictional creations, to the more recent and considerably more commercially visible popular culture phenomena of graphic novels, films, and television series that have introduced Thor, Odin, and other figures from Norse mythology to audiences numbering in the hundreds of millions across the modern world, whatever creative liberties such adaptations inevitably take with the more careful, historically grounded material we have spent tonight patiently exploring together. Perhaps most enduringly, though, the Norse legacy persists simply in the shape of the modern political map itself, in the existence and particular character of the modern nations of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, whose gradual consolidation from the scattered chieftaincies of the pre-Viking Age world we traced across tonight's journey established political structures and national identities that, whatever transformations they have undergone across the intervening millennium, trace a genuine, continuous historical thread back to Harold Fairhair, Harold Bluetooth, and the other consolidating rulers we spent time with earlier tonight, and in the deep historical relationships, sometimes still faintly perceptible in modern national culture and self-understanding, that connect England, Ireland, and Normandy to their own periods of Norse settlement and eventual assimilation, relationships that remind us, as we finally bring tonight's long journey to its close, that the Viking Age, for all its drama and violence, for all the raids and conquests and dramatic battles we have followed across so many hours together tonight, was ultimately, in its deepest and most lasting significance, a story of connection, of a seafaring people from a harsh, beautiful northern landscape reaching outward across open water to touch, trade with, fight against, and eventually blend into dozens of other cultures and societies across an extraordinary span of the medieval world, leaving behind, in language and law, in genetics and literature, in place names and political institutions, a legacy so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the modern world that most of us carry some quiet trace of it with us, entirely unknowingly, in our ordinary daily lives. And so we arrive together at the quiet end of a very long journey, one that has carried us from the fjords and farmsteads of early Scandinavia, through the gods and the ships and the long winters that shaped the people who lived among them, out across open water to monasteries and market towns, to Ireland and Francia and the Mediterranean, northward and westward to Iceland, to Greenland, and to the far, quiet shores of a new continent glimpsed and briefly touched and then, gently, let go and eastward too, along rivers and portages, all the way to the golden domes of a city the Norse themselves called simply the Great City, before finally returning home again to watch kings rise, and empires briefly gather, and then, as all things eventually do, settle back down into the slow, patient rhythm of ordinary history. There is no need to remember any of the dates or the names precisely, no test waiting for you in the morning, only the gentle accumulated sense, if any of it has managed to settle in your mind at all as your own eyes have grown heavier over these past hours, of a distant, cold, beautiful world, and the ordinary, extraordinary people who live their whole lives within it, farming and fishing and raising children, occasionally launching a ship toward some distant horizon, and mostly, simply, enduring, season after season, the long dark and the short bright summers, exactly as people everywhere have always done. Let the rest of this night carry you gently onward now, wherever your own dreams choose to take you, and thank you quietly for spending these long, unhurried hours here with me.